Hi, good evening, everybody who's joining us both here at Amnesty's office in London and those joining us online. My name is Susan Coftree. I'm director of the Foreign Policy Centre, and we're one of the three organisers of tonight's event, together with our partners English Pen and Amnesty International. We're here for a discussion about SLAPPs, an ongoing threat to freedom of expression. SLAPPs is a term, for those who are less familiar, which stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. They've been kind of more well known as a term in other jurisdictions, particularly the US, for a number of years, but they've been growing in prominence in Europe, particularly after the murder of the Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia 5 years ago, who was facing 47 SLAPP cases at the time of her death. And in the UK, there's been a lot of growing awareness about this issue and also solutions on how to address it. SLAPPs are a really particular type of abusive lawsuits, which we have, they're used, or the threat of them is used, to basically silence people who want to speak out about issues in the public interest. At the Foreign Policy Centre, we started researching SLAPPs through a project called Unsafe for Scrutiny 3 years ago, which looked specifically at the risks and threats to journalists who uncover financial crime and corruption. And we were particularly interested in how that linked back to the UK. And we did an early survey of 63 journalists working in 41 countries uncovering financial crime and corruption. And it was very depressing to find out that actually over 70% of them were subject to some form of legal threat. It was posing the greatest challenge to them to be able to continue their work, despite the fact that they might be facing all kinds of other forms of violation, physical attack, and so on. And really depressingly for us, that the UK was the leading international source of these threats, almost as high as those coming from EU countries and the US combined, from those who responded to our survey. So for us, 3 years ago, this was a real red flag, and we co-founded the UK Anti-SLAPP Coalition, which we continue to co-chair with English Pen and also Index on Censorship. And we're a coalition of around 20 organisations who have been monitoring this issue over the last 3 years and looking really actively for solutions and ways to redress. We had made some progress already at the start of 2022. There was already a number of high-profile cases that the coalition was monitoring, including those of Catherine Belton and Tom Burgess, who were being pursued by kleptocrats from foreign states. And perhaps many of you are already aware of those cases. I know they're going to be discussed amongst our panelists this evening. But Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine last February definitely really put a spotlight politically on this issue. We saw last July, and actually, in fact, the reason that we decided when we were first organising this event to hold it this week was because it's the 1-year anniversary of the UK government committing to introducing legislative reform to address SLAPPs. Until about 3 weeks ago, we actually hadn't seen any progress on that commitment, but we now have an amendment brought forward by the government to the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, or it would be an act once it's passed. It's currently still a bill. It's in Parliament. If it's brought through and adopted into law, it will be the first measure in UK law to tackle this issue. However, it will only pertain to cases related to economic crime. And while a lot of the research we've been doing at FPC has really highlighted these cases, and certainly those who are in the receipt of illicit funds are pretty strongly motivated to use those funds to then shut down any criticism or public scrutiny of their wrongdoing, we know that that is really just one part of the story. And so that's why we're really excited to have this event this evening, to widen the lens and look at other aspects and other areas where SLAPPs are used. And we're also very delighted to have Mary Fitzgerald, who's Director of Expression at OSF, one of our supporters, who herself has been subject to SLAPPs, so very well positioned to lead tonight's conversation. So I'm going to hand over to Mary and leave you in her very safe hands to introduce our panelists and lead this discussion this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. It's great to see you all. We've got a great panel, and we've got Nina Cresswell, who's a writer, Peter Apps, who's the deputy editor of Inside Housing and the author of Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen. We've got Simon Dawson from HarperCollins, Simon Dawson-Collins from HarperCollins, and Caroline Keane from Wigan. And we really wanted to focus, as Susan said, on two things. A lot of what has become possible, the reason why we have anti-SLAPP legislation tabled, is unfortunately because of the tragic backdrop of the Ukraine war and the recognition by the government that they had to be seen to be doing something about the fact that this country and this city is a reputation laundromat for Putin's cronies and many other wrongdoers all across the world. And as a result, they were spurred to action when my former colleagues at Open Democracy, for example, revealed how Evgeny Prigozhin, the mercenary Wagner Group warlord, was suing a journalist in this country, even though he was already on the sanctions list, and other egregious examples. But someone like Prigozhin, or even Roman Abramovich, right, is a kind of YouTube bogeyman. They're the caricature foreign villain, the person from somewhere else who's doing something terrible to good upstanding British people. And the truth is that up and down this country every day, there are kind of, in my opinion, low-grade scumbags, of a domestic variety, who are abusing our laws and our courts every day to threaten, intimidate, and bully these people on the panel, many of your clients. And there are also scumbags who are elected representatives who are supposed to be speaking for us. Actually, some of whom are leaders of political parties or have served in cabinet, who also engage in this abusive behavior. So we really wanted to sort of narrow the frame here to this country. And we also wanted to talk about journalism, but more than journalism, because anyone can be slapped. You don't have to be a journalist to be slapped or threatened. And what we're talking about here is merely the tip of the iceberg. It's those people who don't have power, who don't have agency, who don't have representation, who don't have the access to the expertise to fight these things, who are at the real sharp end of this. So with that, I wanted to turn over first to Nina to just talk a little bit about your experience of being slapped and what it taught you.
Yeah, sure. So in my experience, it was actually a tattooist who slapped me. He had sexually assaulted me in 2010, and I'd gone to the police about it, did all the things that I thought you were supposed to do. The police didn't help me on the night. In fact, the High Court judge described their investigation as superficial, deficient, and frankly bizarre. They said things like, when I told them that the assault felt like a nightmare, they said, they wrote in their police log, has dreams of being raped. So it was, as you can imagine, I had this strong sense of injustice, but also when I was sexually assaulted, I'd just finished my second year of university. So I was really young, and I didn't know how to even process the assault itself, let alone do the police's job for them. And I did try and investigate it myself, but I wasn't helped at all. So I pushed it down for 10 years. And then in 2020, there was a series of events that led me to feel like it was urgent to name the man who had sexually assaulted me. Like I say, he worked as a tattooist, so he was always, he was with half-naked women a lot of the time who, have to be in a position of vulnerability to be tattooed. So I named him on social media, and I wrote a blog describing what he'd done. And his reaction to that was he slapped me with a claim for defamation. So my background is in magazine journalism. I studied that at uni, and naively, I thought that because I'd done a tiny media law module as part of that, I thought, well, I know a little bit about it, and as long as I'm telling the truth, I'll be safe. But the reality is really a lot different to that. It's notoriously difficult to defend these cases. They are designed to be impossible to defend. So when I first got the legal letter, it was extremely threatening and terrifying. And his lawyer was saying, you have to apologize, you have to take these posts down, you have to pay his legal costs. And I had no money, no assets. I wasn't entitled to legal aid. really didn't know what to do. For the first year, I was my own lawyer, but that takes over your life. I had my own business and I couldn't work anymore because I was consumed by this case. So my business went down. I was broke. I was living out my overdraft. So I got a part-time job to make ends meet. And then I'd be working 9 to 5 at my work, and then 5:30 to midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning as a lawyer with no experience at all. I eventually found representation, which was funded by the Good Law Project. And we won the case. We won on a truth defence and we won on a public interest defence, which was the first time that a public interest defence had been tested in the context of an abuser and survivor dispute. So it was a really big win, but it made me wonder, you know, just how many women this had happened to and how many victims this had happened to. And if these anti-SLAPP laws, if the government or lawmakers, you know, put funding and money into making it easier for victims to speak out against these, because if we can't speak about it, we can't change anything. Then imagine how much we could help people. And someone messaged me on Twitter who was she'd won her defamation case as well, and she said the truth is like a lion. Let it out, and it'll defend itself. You don't have to defend it. I think I've mixed that quote up a bit, but the sentiment's there, and I'd saved it, and I was like, oh, that's really nice, but like, actually, the reality is you need to be able to afford to defend it, and like these cases aren't just a petty legal dispute. It's not just some tiny little thing. It's a full-on existential assault that can take years of your life. It was almost 3 years of mine, and it nearly took my life because it was just so horrible, and my only option to get out of it was to apologize to the man who'd sexually assaulted me. And I think this is so important, all the work that's being done here, because like I think we need to look at actually the motives of the people who are willing to take such extreme measures to silence someone who does not, it's not a fair fight. You can't fight back. Then we need to look at their motives and not the one of those who are criticizing them.
Thank you so much, Nina.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. We'll come a bit more to why that came to pass, as in what are the rules and systems in place that made your experience such an ordeal. We'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I wanted to turn to Peter now, and you know, before this, Peter, you and I were sort of taking our pick of all the stories you could possibly tell, but you had a couple that in particular that you wanted to share to sort of paint a picture for us.
Sure. So I'm, as for those of you who aren't familiar with Inside Housing, we're a sort of professional magazine. It's mostly read by people who work in housing. Particularly over the last 6 years, we've written a lot about the Grenfell Tower fire and the companies and individuals that were responsible for what happened there. You might not think that that's the sort of niche professional journalism is an area where you would have to engage with media law very much, but it's actually a very regular part of our work. A couple of examples I'll give. One which is actually ongoing at the moment. A few weeks ago, I was invited to visit a block of flats in northwest London, which have been converted from an office to a residential use, with quite vulnerable residents living there. And it's had serious issues with water penetration, and damp and mold was absolutely rampant throughout the building. A medical charity I visited shortly before me, and determined that I think 18 of the 20 children that they examined were suffering from respiratory issues as a direct consequence of living in the building. It was, you know, under investigation by the local authority. There was documentary evidence which proved that. It was quite easy to get photographic evidence of some of the issues. But when I took that to the landlord, because as a journalist, before you run a story, you contact the organization you're writing about and offer them the opportunity to respond. And that is mostly where the SLAPP process kind of kicks in, to mix metaphors slightly. And so they responded with a six-page legal letter, telling us that they'd sue the magazine and they'd sue me in a personal regard if we ran this story, and attempting to I think they sent us 30 pages worth of evidence, which supposedly showed that the issues weren't actually that serious and the tenants were all lying, or they just denied access to their contractors or whatever. And that puts you in a very, very difficult position as a magazine, because they'll be accusing you of innuendo. So you can maybe prove the facts that you would write about, but can you prove the further innuendo that this organization is a rogue landlord of some sort, and that gets difficult. Another example I'll give is a guy who served as an expert witness to the Grenfell Tower inquiry and wrote and writes official guidance for government on fire safety rules, including the fire safety rules around the evacuation of disabled residents from high-rise buildings. And that's become very controversial since Grenfell, because the advice was essentially that disabled residents should stay put, and it's not really necessary to provide a plan for their escape. And of course, at Grenfell Tower, a very disproportionate number of the victims were disabled, and the reason they died was because they weren't able to escape. There were some historic posts of his on a internet forum, which showed him making jokes about watching rude tube videos of disabled people trying to escape from a burning building, which were actually mentioned in Parliament by Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson, who's one of our Paralympic heroes, and now a legislator. And we wanted to report her comments, which, as everyone with a passing understanding of media law will know, are covered by absolute privilege, having been said in the House of Lords. We did them the courtesy of going to them for the right of reply in that story, which we could have got away without doing, and immediately got a legal letter threatening us with legal action were we to run the story. We're lucky enough to have high quality legal advice, so we were able to run that story, but many other publications don't have access to any form of legal advice, no access to any form of libel insurance, and no means to defend themselves. So as soon as that threat lands, or a similar threat lands, they will simply not publish. And that means that the amount of stories that can make it into the public domain is hugely diminished, because there's this button that is available to organizations. They only need to be the size to access a small law firm. And then they have an option which will, in many instances, simply stop a perfectly factual story in the public interest from ever being published. So yeah, I could go on all night with more, but I think that's my 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate that. Simon, you've represented some people who are household names in this space right now. But one of the things you and I were talking about before, and you can talk about the clients you represented, was some of the most bizarre, threatening, odd, kind of Orwellian moments in the years-long experience that many of your clients have had. So I was going to invite you to.
Well, thank you. I'm the general counsel at HarperCollins, and we published Catherine Belton's book and Tom Burgess's book, Kleptopia. And I was very pleased to receive a message at the start saying that Catherine Belton is actually watching online. So hello, Catherine. So I don't act for clients, but we publish authors. So Peter's reference to the high quality legal advice that he received is a reference to Caroline, not to me. So I just thought I'd clarify that. And actually, Peter's 6-page legal letter, I would cherish receiving that, but because often we get much longer letters than that. But they are designed, as you were saying, to suppress the truth. I mean, we had one, I think just last week, from a very well-known firm. You could probably do a lot of, you could guess within a number of firms which one it might be. You might be wrong, but you could guess. And it was saying, you know, the book that we are due to publish in the future, don't publish that book because you'll get a libel action, you'll have a privacy action. They hadn't even read the book. At the end, they said, please send us a copy of the book. You're thinking, what on earth do they think that we're going to do? So I think we just ignored that. But I think Catherine and Tom's cases in turn were two cases prior to the Ukrainian invasion. And they were authors who were trying to highlight the problems which are now apparent to all of us. And I'm sure everyone's read Putin's People by Catherine. But if you haven't, I commend it to you. But particularly, I think it's chapter 13, which is called Londongrad, which talks about how there's the infiltration and corruption of British society by obshak, black cash from oligarchs that goes unchecked. And you know, the importance of Catherine's book was that as soon as we say we had won that litigation, but that there were other sort of views on that. There was a whole plethora of other stories coming out, including a 40-minute panorama, I think, and the floodgates were opened, and people felt that they were able to call out this very, you know, egregious, as I think someone said, behaviour. So what Catherine and Tom do is, and others, is obviously very important. But as Nina was saying, the sort of strain on you personally, it sounds awful, but on professional authors, it means what else are they, you know, it's an all-consuming process. And that is part of the purpose of these types of litigation, to stop them writing more stories about the targets they have already written about, and to stop them doing their work in the future. And not one of my authors, but another person that was at one time represented by somebody in this room, when I asked them what was the worst thing that could happen, expecting them to say, oh, well, you know, I might go bankrupt, I might lose my house. They said, I might be killed. You know, that was the fear. Now, whether or not that was a fear which was, you know, had any foundation in reality, I don't know. But, you know, that is what these people go through. And both Tom and Catherine were surveilled and felt that they were, and there was evidence to prove the truth that they were. And the idea in both those cases in which we supported the authors 100%, we were sued in other jurisdictions as well. It wasn't just for the same, it was a satellite litigation. And if an author's on their own, they can't cope with that. I mean, it's a 7-figure sum at least to defend these sort of cases. So one of the other things I was asked to just touch upon was how we protect and look after our authors. So we stand behind them 100%. We have to. And that's part of our job as ethical publishers, I think. But part of that comes from building a relationship of trust and psychological safety with the author. So there's a transparent relationship. There's, you know, you try and avoid groupthink. So there are a diversity of views. We don't just accept what authors say, you know, have to challenge it pre-publication and also during the course of the pre-pub process, but also post-publication as well. And I think that sort of psychological safety is extremely important. And then there's a tension, obviously, between a commercial company profit and the proving the truth of what we have published, and also standing by our authors. So there is a line to draw there, but you know, many decades now in the role that I do, it always puts the author at the heart of everything we do.
Thank you very much. They're very lucky to have you. Caroline, we've done a bit of a survey of the full range of this sort of opera of operatic landscape of SLAPPs. Why does this happen? And you know, you were going to go into some of the. I mean, we think we live in a country where there's free speech, freedom of expression. So why? And what are some of the common misconceptions around this?
I'll try not to turn this into a law lecture. Um, it's interesting when you asked me to address the common misconceptions. The one that hit me that I think people don't realize is that the law in this country is not designed to protect free speech. Whatever the government is saying now about it's important to protect free speech, our law has never been designed to protect free speech. It is designed to protect reputation, and since 1998 to protect privacy. And until people get their heads around that, you will carry on stumbling in the situation that we're all in. So the other thing I've been asked about is, why is it the only subject where the burden of proof is reversed? Well, technically it isn't. The claimant has got a burden of proof. It's so easy that a 5-year-old child can meet the burden of proof, but it is still there. All they have to do is show identification, they're usually named, publication, usually self-evident, and a defamatory meaning. And anything you've written that is critical of somebody, which is what you're all in the business of doing, is going to be potentially defamatory. Once they've done that, that's when the burden switches to you. And again, as Nina said, you will know what the defences are. You know that as long as I'm telling the truth, I'm safe, that's a defence. If it's my honest opinion, that's a defence. If it's in the public interest, that's a defence. But it isn't as simple as that, because what you're trying to defend is not the meaning that you thought that you were giving to these words, but the meaning that a person, the reasonable reader or viewer, who is not avid for scandal, but not unduly innocent, puts on the words. And that might not be what you meant at all. A judge might find that the words mean that effectively you're accusing somebody of something that they're guilty of some sort of crime, for instance. And you might say, no, I wasn't meaning to do that. I was trying to say that this had happened and this had happened and this had happened. And really we should investigate it. Really we should suspect that there's something that's gone on. But once the judge has said, no, it means guilt, you have to defend it by proving the truth of what you said. And so very often it's not something you set out to do, but also because it's assumed to be false, the claimant doesn't have to do anything. You've got to do all the legwork. You've got to get your credible sources, some of whom have given you information at risk to themselves, to agree to come and give evidence. You've got to produce the documents. You've got to piece together the Panama Papers. This is why it starts to become so expensive, because it is reversed in that way, because it's designed to protect reputation. It's not designed to protect free speech. And I know we're going to come on later to SLAPPs and where we've got to, and that is all good. But until the government honestly grasps the need to protect free speech, we're just tinkering around the edges. The way a libel case will work these days is a big improvement on what used to be the case. It used to be that you had a jury trial, and until the case had gone in front of a jury, you didn't know what they would say the meaning of the words was. So you didn't know whether the defence that you were putting forward would actually stack up, because this was being decided in the jury room and you would never have that answer. What happened after 2013 was that the juries were pretty much abolished and the judges then started to be able to say the meaning. It has been one of the most powerful tools that we as defendants have, because it means at a relatively early stage, it's still usually at least 6 figures in, we have somebody who's independent who will look at it. And what always happens is the claimant lawyers put what we call a really high meaning on the words. They will make out that you've said the worst thing you possibly could say, because they probably know you can't prove that. So we get in front of a judge and we say, Judge, look at this. What does it actually mean? Is it going to be something that we can defend? We have to put forward our own examples. So sometimes we're digging very deep into the research that you've done before we've even got to the first stage of going to the judge and saying, this is what we say it means. Because unless we know you've got the evidence to back that up, we might be actually digging you an even bigger hole. So the pre-action work, or the work that goes on from the minute the claim is issued to even this meaning hearing is really in-depth and very time-consuming. As I say, it might sound easy to say it's true. Very often it is true, but you're the one who's got to prove it. So I'm not going to go on forever now, because I know there's a lot more things to debate, but I hope that gives you a flavour of why this is, it's like Alice in Wonderland. And it has become so complicated now that even specialists and Simon and I have been doing this for decades, there are cases I'm doing now where I actually can't understand the law. And if that's happening to experts who do this all the time, it's got to be changed. It cannot be right for people not to be able to understand what the law is so that they can themselves get themselves the right side of it.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to come back to you now because we're going to flip into the what can be done, what needs to be done, what can be done, and obviously there is a model anti-SLAPP law that the coalition has developed that's on the table and that's been partially adopted, as Susan said. What will that fix, and what will it not fix?
I'm going to back to Charlie in a minute on this because Charlie has slogged through all the legislation. Charlie was instrumental in putting forward the model bill that Parliament hasn't been able to adapt, but they've taken some of the concepts and I think it's fair that we'd all say it's an improvement. It's just we're not there yet. It is helping, as I say, because we have got now a SLAPP that might come on, a SLAPP's law that might come on the books. There are things to be done, and I really would wish you'd do it, Charlie, but there are things where you've still got questions of the intent of the claimant in there. Now, we don't want to have anything to do with what the claimant meant, because if we're getting into that, all they'll do is they'll say, I was worried about you were publishing untruths about me, that all my intention is to put right these untruths. And it's terribly difficult to get into somebody's head. So we don't want that. That's got to go. We've also got to have something where the minute it seems to be a SLAPP, the case stops. You shouldn't have a situation where you're carrying on incurring all these costs and all these costs trying to defend yourself when you've got something that's probably being brought for an improper purpose. The real problem that we have on this is that it's terribly difficult to define. The more you try and define it, the more you offer fertile ground for lawyers to pick over going forward. It is one of those things that you really do know it when you see it. And Tom and Catherine's cases and the one against Charlotte Leslie, those are obviously SLAPPs. I know a bit of a loner on this, but I'd really like to see a situation where, first of all, the judges are directed as a matter of law, free speech is paramount, not reputation. And secondly, you let them take a view on whether the material is sufficiently in the public interest that it needs to be debated, regardless of what the underlying facts are. That one's not going through. Books like, yeah, Tom's book and Catherine's book, thank you, are so evidently in the public interest. Peter's work on Glenville is so evidently in the public interest. Anybody reporting on maternity units at the NHS is evidently in the public interest. Those have got to go through. They've got to be strong enough to be publicly debated without being held up by libel cases. And until we see that, we are just tinkering around the edges. Though I'm so proud of everybody that's worked on this to get as far as we have.
What is the route to getting to that protection of free speech? Because that feels like a very long
It's a
way
big
politically, right? I mean, you have the First Amendment in the US, like that.
We have to keep lobbying and never give up.
Right. And do you feel like that would be a higher lift? It's an incredibly high lift, but would trying to change the terms of the burden of proof be a sort of less high lift, although it's still very high lift?
Yeah. If you made it so that the claimant had to prove it was false, that would be a big step forward.
Right. Yeah. Because that seems to me the anomaly here. But yeah, no, I mean, please do come in on what you think is good about the law, what we've achieved, what we still need to achieve.
Well, I think, I mean, Charlie's done a lot of
Come
good-
on, Charlie, take the mic.
good work, so he can talk about the technicalities of it. But I think, I mean, I was at an all-parliamentary group in Parliament, I think in November of last year, where with Gail Rebuck and John Whittingdale and somebody from the MOJ, and they were really debating, saying, well, there's no parliamentary time, you know, to put any of this SLAPP stuff in. And, you know, I'm not sure what else they were doing, but, you know, that's apparently there's no time to do this. And, you know, I think we did suggest, I went with the Publishers Association, we did suggest, well, you know, there is the economic crime bill, so why not put it in there? And the MOJ probably said has some merit, I think. Well, you know, if you have a sort of partial SLAPP law, what happens to the bits that are left out, which aren't economic crime? And there is that sort of two different bits of legislation or more, you know, can be confusing. But I think my view was, well, just get something on the statute books because it indicates a principle. So I'm sort of, you know, subject to sensible sort of tinkering and redrafting. I'm pretty happy with what's there as a start.
Great, thank you. And I mean, one of the things we were all talking about before this discussion was the fact that you can change a law, you can work with regulators, and we'll come to that in a moment. But it's not just about what's on the books or what regulators enforce. It's about culture inside newsrooms, inside politics. I've mentioned that a lot of the attempted SLAPPs that came to open democracy came from politicians. And inside the law and judiciary, so like how judges actually interpret meaning and what they value. To your point, I wanted to turn to you, Peter, because I think the newsroom piece is actually quite important too. I mean, we were very lucky at Open Democracy to have an excellent lawyer and retainer who was pretty bullish. I mean, he long before this became more publicized within the industry, he said, strictly private and confidential means nothing. Publish those letters, publish your threats, and they'll go away. And he was right. So we were lucky to have someone who advised us on that, but that's not widely known. It wasn't then, it's a bit more widely known now. And, you know, I've observed this in many newsrooms, a real sort of caution. And I understand where it comes from, but I think that there's a sort of culture change piece that needs to happen there as well. Like we ended up learning Open Democracy that if we were really public about the attacks we faced, people would support us. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I've worked at Inside Housing for a long time, which is one particular type of news organization, but I mean, most will err on the side of caution because they have to, or they feel they have to. You know, I've from time to time, I've been contacted by other journalists in my career at other newsrooms who've said, I wanted to write this story. I couldn't because the editors were too scared about legal. Do you want it? And it's very unusual for journalists to try and give other journalists their stories, but they just wanted to get it into the public domain, and they didn't think that their editors would let them, because editors, you know, media training for editors is okay, but it's not that detailed. You're not a lawyer. And so it's much easier to just go, you can always fill a newspaper with something. And it's much, much easier to just go for something that's not going to get you into a fight. I mean, even stories that your lawyers tell you can win, or you have a good chance of winning, you know, I've been advised from time to time that you kind of have like a 75% chance here. That's not going to be good enough for my editor. It's just not, because the 25% is a risk that is potentially fatal to the future of the publication. And so, you know, it is good if you've got someone who's bullish, but I understand why people aren't reckless, especially when, you know, you've got to understand how small local media organizations are. They can't afford insurance of this sort. How are they going to survive? So they just back down, and that's really what gives SLAPPs the power that they have. Is that people don't have? There's no equality of arms.
I would be remiss here not to mention a fantastic new initiative called Reporters Shield, which is some of our partners have thanks to a partnership with the insurance firm AIG and some funding from the US government, have set up an insurance scheme for journalists who are publishing stories in the public interest. And the scheme works as a membership scheme. So if you pay a membership fee, you are insured and your legal costs will be covered if you're attacked legally, if you face a SLAPP. And the SLAPP can be quite wide. It can be a privacy suit. It can be a defamation case. The only criteria is it's related to your journalism, right? So it has to be something that's to do with your reporting. But if you are attacked and threatened or sued as a result of your reporting, and you can prove it's in the public interest, and you went through appropriate steps to accurately report in public interest, you will have your legal fees covered in their entirety. You'll be provided a lawyer if you need one, and you'll have your legal fees covered. And the genius of this scheme is that it doesn't defend against damages. So if the case finds against you and you have to pay damages, that's not covered. But that's actually quite clever, because it doesn't make you a mark for people to come and attack you, but it means that if you have a strong case, the cost of doing business, the cost of defending your story is far lower, and the cost of engagement from the 99% of attempted slappers who don't actually want to go to court, but just want to shut you up, suddenly goes up massively. So for anyone who hasn't heard about Reporters Shield, check it out. I've got more information about it after this session as well. It's one of the most hopeful things that's come out of the industry in recent years. And what I love about it is it's an innovation designed by journalists for journalists. And I think that it's a very, very important thing. But you know, it's not going to cover all these situations, right? It's one thing. But I mean, Nina, you were sued personally, right? You didn't have a publisher backing you, you didn't have an outlet backing you. So I'm curious to hear what you think needs to happen now too.
In order to protect individuals,
Yeah,
rather than
exactly. I mean,
yeah.
there's a very famous case, Carol Cadwallader, who, you know, was sued personally by Aaron Banks. Many of my employees were also threatened with personal lawsuits as well as lawsuits against open democracy. And you know, I remember one of our star reporters calling me and saying, Mary, am I going to lose my house?
Yeah.
Even though we had legal defense lined up, that was something that we couldn't guarantee wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
So because he was being sued personally as well as a publication. So I'm curious to hear, like, what could be done to protect people who are freelancers or, you know, writing blogs or, you know, not protected by.
Yeah, I mean,
organizations.
some kind of legal aid would be a helpful start, but
Mhm.
I think in terms of defamation cases, in my case, with it being sexual assault, this is, I think, when the Me Too movement happened, the reactive response was defamation, and the scales are not balanced at all in terms of reputation and freedom of expression and freedom to be free of violence. Like, that's not a human right, that's respected. So I think there needs to be a huge shift there in order to be able to feel safe in the first place to speak out. I don't know the answer whether it's a change in the law or a new law. It's hard to say, but I think there needs to be a huge cultural shift as well. It depends on each different case, but generally, I think, Caroline, you were saying it's the only it's like one of the only crimes where the victim becomes like the scrutinized one, and that, I think there needs to be education there as well.
Thank you. I mean, that point about culture change, I think obviously one of the big culture changes that needs to happen is in the legal industry. And actually, again, there've been, I wouldn't say culture change, but there've been some positive moves from the regulator. And I'm curious to hear you talk about that, Caroline.
And that the Solicitors Regulatory Authority is taking it quite seriously. I think they were quite stung by the government reaction to the way that the oligarch cases, as Simon said, a lot of this was triggered by Catherine and Tom's case, plus the Ukraine war. And I think the Solicitors Regulatory Authority realised that the profession was coming into disrepute. So they have issued guidance that basically says that SLAPPs are unprofessional. There are various regulations governing solicitors at the moment, and one of them being that you must act in a way that upholds public trust and confidence in the profession and in legal services provided by authorised persons. So they have issued guidance. I know that they're very keen to show that the guidance has teeth, and they're working quite hard on cases that have been referred to them. I suspect that they will be issuing findings shortly. I think that another thing that is going through is trying to give the SRA more powers to demand production of documents. They don't have that many powers at the moment. Is it having an effect? I think it is. It certainly hasn't stopped receiving very long letters from very well-known firms, which I've got several of just this year. But I think if they are disciplined, I think it will have an effect. I've also seen a couple of the larger firms that had reputation management divisions have stopped it.
Oh,
So
that's
that
so
is-
cathartic to hear.
It's a very, very, very small change.
Okay, this
Yeah.
personally like warms my heart because I mean, one of the sort of scandals of our time is that legal firms can also be reputation management and PR firms at the same time. And they offer their clients a full range of services, everything from defending their reputation to going out and destroying the reputations of others through to harassment in the courts, you name it. And the worst thing about it is that often they claim, and I think wrongly in the eyes of the law, but they often claim and get away with claiming that their reputation management services are covered by privilege. So they can be cloaked in secrecy, or even if they procure reputation management services for their clients, even from a different firm, that is also cloaked in privilege, which is just one of the most egregious abuses of power. You know, I definitely one of the hallmarks of a particularly aggressive pursuit that we dealt with at Open Democracy was from a lawyer / reputation manager.
I mean, I think just on the SRA, I spoke to the SRA about this and their ongoing investigation a few weeks ago for quite a long time. So they're very interested in doing it. And they have, in fact, the guidance that Caroline refers to is actually a warning. So
It's a warning notice.
yeah, exactly. So that is significant, I think, and that has affected behaviours. And the impression I got was that they were, and I've also spoken to the General Counsel of the SRA, who appeared particularly keen not to let this slide.
You know, it's one of those things that when I was sort of pushing you on culture change within newsrooms, I mean, I was reflecting on the fact that there actually has demonstrably been a bit of a culture change in the industry, in the news industry. It used to be our dirty little secret. If you ever got sued, it was just, you would just hide yourself in a cloud of shame. Because even the suggestion that you've done anything wrong or got anything wrong as a journalist keeps you up all night and keeps you raking over and over and over again the things you've said and the facts that you stood up, and did you do it right, and could you have said it differently, could have done it differently. So it's gaslighting of the highest order, and the fact that that now more of us are speaking up. We are talking about our experiences, and as a profession, we're talking about our experiences, and we should widen that beyond journalism as well. In itself, that's part of the power of threatening people who speak out in the public interest. And if we aren't threatened and we aren't cowed by it, then that is, I think, a really positive development. And you can't measure it, right? It's not the same thing as getting a new law passed or a new warning notice issued. But actually, the press can be really powerful, and you know, I think that's something that we collectively need to bear in mind and not be afraid to stand up and speak out about.
And I think that will create an environment where you might get a law change similar to the law in the US. It's
Right.
only when people really understand what happens here. Because at the moment, although it's been coming out for the last year or so, it's still very easy, and it often is said, to the MOJ in one of those sessions and so on. The claimant lawyers say, well, we've seen no evidence of SLAPPs. No, this doesn't happen. Never come across it. And it's only when you have the people like Nina, like Peter on a business-to-business magazine, rather than necessarily your high-profile things, when people see that this is what's happening all the time, that you'll get a wind of change coming over.
Yeah, and when you can equate it to experiences that lots of people can relate to, sexual assault, children who are having health problems, housing that's unsafe, I think that's when, as you say, you get a broader brushstroke. Do you want to say something else?
But I mean, on that point, the amount of people, including people that are leading lawyers at national news publications, that said prior to Catherine's case, they wouldn't have written about the oligarchs because they were cowed into silence. But when I was doing pre-pub at the BBC, a very well-known BBC personality, not the one that's been in the news recently, said to me, if we don't get sued, we're not doing our job properly. And it's not so much a mark of shame, but I think it's some people that have been sued might consider it to be a badge of honor. And I just got a note from Catherine that she might be coming, so you can ask her about what she feels about.
Yeah, I think that sort of jujitsu pivot, which is what we started doing, we started being public and raising money to fight these cases, was actually a real, it was a pleasant surprise.
Because as you say, there is this sort of reputation management. I'm going to isolate and suppress this story, this story, this story. The BBC had, the panorama on the stocks for years because they couldn't have put that together. That came out directly after the Abramovich case, in the amount of time. But another national news organization was cowed into silence. BBC didn't publish that, and there were no doubt many others.
Just to add on the point about how this is not just one type of claimant and one type of story. One of the things that came out during the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which we wrote about, was an organization called Kingspan, which produced some of the insulation, which ultimately ended up on the walls of the of Grenfell Tower and many other buildings. It actually came under a bit of pressure in 2015, it's a couple of years before Grenfell, from industry regulators, from the National House Building Council, who had been told that their product was combustible, potentially dangerous, and not suitable for use on high-rise buildings, and were going to send a memo to building control inspectors to say this product is in wide use on high-rise buildings in the UK, but you need to stop signing it off because it's not allowed under our regulations. And they were prevented from doing that by Kingspan's immediate response, which was to try and sue them, threaten them with action for defamation. It wasn't construction law that they tried to sue them under, or any sort of contractual thing about the relationship that they had between each other. It was because they said that letter will be defamatory and it'll be harmful to our interests. And so, I've heard anecdotally of kind of private landlords using defamation threats against, say, a local authority's environmental health team to prevent them from putting an improvement notice on a building with damp. There's camaraderie in a newsroom. You probably work with an editor who's had plenty of legal letters before and the world hasn't come crashing down around them. But if you work for a building control inspector and you're trying to not sign a building off, you've got absolutely no idea what any of this means. And it was successful. The NHBC did not put that letter out. They kowtowed to what Kingspan wanted them to do, and we carried on putting that material on building.
Thank you so much. That's a really, I think, strong note to turn over to the audience now and to get some questions and comments and inputs as well. I mean, many of you here are experts on this subject, so feel free to make any points you think we haven't covered or we haven't fully addressed. Yes, so we'll do two and then we'll come to the panel.
Hello, that was an amazing panel discussion. I was wondering, I guess this is a question for Caroline, I think. Basically, when I was studying media law at university, I was a journalism student. We were under the impression that public interest, the idea of something being in the public interest was enough for something to be published. And you were talking a lot about the legal process behind SLAPPs and how the burden of proof is kind of on the one being sued and on the journalist or whatever. But I was wondering, how does the idea of public interest, does it not defend people in SLAPPs cases? Because I guess there's this idea, I think most people assume that this tenet of public interest would protect journalists, but I guess it's really surprising to see that it doesn't. Another quick question is, like, I know that a lot of the people using SLAPPs to sue persons of interest always, like, they sometimes try to sue the individual rather than the organization. I was wondering, do some organizations, or could some organizations, take up the legal costs of the individual rather than, because they haven't been sued, they don't help out the individual? Yeah, thank you.
Shall I answer the last bit?
You do the
first?
last.
Yeah, I
bit,
can
and
do
then
that
I'll
as
do
well,
the
actually,
next
because we might have similar answers.
It's interesting you say, I mean, I think I said that we do stand behind our authors, and, we did stand behind, as a publisher, Catherine and Tom.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, yeah, and that's what ethical publishers and newsrooms do. I mean, when for example, the instance I'm talking about, Open Democracy, where the company was being threatened and the individual, we again stood with the individual and the company, but we also were advised that at some point we might need to get the individual separate legal advice, because even though we were together on this, the interests might subtly diverge, and in ways that, and they were entitled to their own representation. So we had a conversation about that, and it didn't get to that point, but we were willing to do that because that's sometimes what's needed. And I think that's rarer.
I mean, conflicts can emerge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that is why, you know, transparency, psychological safety, openness, all that stuff I was talking about earlier is really important up
Mhm.
front, so you can minimize that happening, although it can happen. It can happen.
Yeah, it can.
Many of our members get sued individually and with their publishers not being sued, because if that's the case, even if they're named on the insurance policies don't come into play, which means that for small publishers, they maybe can't afford to stand behind them.
Absolutely.
And so it is specifically done so that people can't rely on insurance.
That's
So
absolutely right.
That's the point.
Yeah.
And one we can't overlook. And again, we need to look into how we can amend that so that the insurance policies will cover individuals, even if their publishers aren't.
And if you're sort of intentional about this as a procurer of insurance and you have some resources, then you can put that in your insurance, right? So there are ways now for those who are thinking, businesses that are thinking intentionally about this, to insure freelancers. It costs a lot more, but possible. And I mean, Carol Cadwallader has spoken very publicly about how the Guardian didn't stand behind her precisely for this reason. I think that does not reflect well on them. And that's something they have reflected on since. But coming to the public interest
Yes.
question.
Okay, you're 100% right that there is a defence of public interest, just as there is a defence of truth and honest opinion. The problem with public interest is essentially that the section in the Defamation Act says that to win on public interest, you have to show that the publisher had a reasonable belief in the truth of what they were publishing and that it was in the public interest. And it's those words, reasonable belief. So what happens is that when you're running a public interest defence, it's you, the writer, the journalist, that's on trial. It's not the claimant. It all comes down to, what did you do to verify the story? This is where we're talking about Peter's right to reply letters and so on. Yeah, what did you do when they told you there was nothing in the story? Why did you think that you could believe that source? What did you do to double check and triple check? Why did you use that word on a book of how many pages in Catherine's book? Why did you use that particular sentence that you researched 10 years ago? You're put under the microscope like that at great expense. So you're 100% right. There is a defence of public interest, but the practice and procedure that goes around it makes it another very, very expensive defence. And you're on trial, and that adds to the stress.
600, I think,
Yeah.
500 plus 100
Yeah.
pages of footnotes. And if you haven't got and Tom Burgess said he got more letters of complaint and responses to his book, which was about 350 pages. The letters of complaints and responses were more than the length of the book. So, and there has been a case, I've forgotten what it is, but Robin or Caroline will remind me, where Nicklin said, if you don't make contemporaneous notes of records of decisions at the start, what's it? Le show, yeah. If you don't make contemporaneous notes, then you lose your public interest. If you haven't put the there's other cases, it may be the same case. If you haven't put the allegations to the target, then you lose your public interest.
You don't 100% lose it.
Seraphim, yeah. I mean, you can do,
but you can.
So the point is, you know, that on the very specific things that public interest defence is vulnerable.
So I wanted to go to political allies to broaden the question out beyond the House of Lords, but also absolutely to take that in. And I was curious to hear people's views on that one. Who should we be working with? Who are we working with? And this is something, again, members of the audience can volunteer as well. We had a quite interesting discussion hosted by Prospect Magazine a little while, where some former Supreme Court justices were in the room weighing in, including on the issue of freedom of expression and how we need a First Amendment. So yeah, to the panel, but also to the audience, if to answer that one.
Probably the most prominent person who's been running this is David Davis. He has really, really taken up the cudgels and has had, 3 or 4 debates where he's named names and brought it back into Parliament. He's not letting it go.
The honourable member for the Isle of Wight,
Yeah.
his name I forget.
That's it.
I mean, Gail Rebuck
Yeah.
in the House of Lords,
Yeah.
John Whittingdale, but I haven't been hanging out with too many High Court judges.
Yeah.
Neither have I just don't move in the right circle.
No, exactly.
There's a question at the back there.
Yeah, Rupert Cooper-Coles. I'm a solicitor at a media defence firm, RPC. My question's for the whole panel, and it's really to do with the fact that much of the progress we've made in SLAPPs, I think everybody recognised, has come off the back of the Ukraine war. And I wondered whether, with all the furore over the last couple of weeks about discussion about privacy rights and freedom of expression in the Hugh Edwards case, whether we, whether there's a risk that, you know, we've been riding on the waves of this Ukraine crisis, but in terms of keeping political support for the SLAPPs debate, when you look at privacy rights or libel rights in a different context where people are much more sympathetic, we're at risk of losing political support. And, you know, I've seen reports about Labour, for example, thinking about bringing in tougher regulation for the media and the like. So yeah, I'd just be interested in anyone on the panel's views on, you know, whether when we're debating these issues, we need to engage in, you know, all areas of free speech rather than even if it's, you know, coming from a publication we might not feel sympathy with. Yeah, and where we feel sympathy for you know, someone's private life. So I'd be interested in any views from the panel on that.
Thank you. I'll take one more if there is one more.
We've got one online from Mark Hanna, who thanks you all for your presentation and has a question for Caroline about how SLAPPs are terribly hard to define. What do you think of the definition adopted by judiciary in Banks v. Cadwallader, no legitimate attempt at vindication?
Okay, which way round? Go. Do you want to do that one first? And
No,
then we'll
not
come
really.
to it's a bit difficult because it's still live, right?
Yeah. I mean, not so much that, but I haven't got immediately at my fingertips what the judicial definition was. Anybody?
I
help
think
with
that was quoted. So yeah, I can go again with that.
Was quotes, no legitimate attempt at vindication was what they put as a definition in the Banks v. Cadwallader case.
No legitimate attempt at vindication.
I don't
Yeah,
understand.
I mean, no, I can see that. I think. I mean, it's so difficult to put your finger on it. I mean, that is a good definition. Somebody has brought a case because they're not really so worried about clearing their name on the back of it. They have an ulterior motive. And I think that is fair. I think where we struggle is, of course, you're then put in a position where you're trying to show what their ulterior motive is. And that takes you down yet another lawyer's wormhole of huge expense. And, you know, why did you do? Well, I did it to vindicate my reputation. And then you're sitting there saying, but you can't possibly have done that. I mean, if I take an example, a real example, it was that Rosneft sued Catherine. So the Russian state-owned oil company that had been in litigation worldwide sued Catherine over her amazing book. But, you know, with all respect, Catherine's references to Rosneft had been aired around the world and is not going to make any difference to Rosneft's reputation in any material way. No serious harm in any material way. So those proceedings cannot, in my view, have ever been brought with a genuine attempt to vindicate a reputation. And that comes down to sort of, you know it when you see it.
Thank you. I wanted to come to the Hugh Edwards question, I think, because I can see obviously that there are issues around defamation and privacy activated here, but what you have, at least on face value, is poor journalism. The allegations that were made that weren't substantiated. You can argue about whether other allegations that were substantiated were in the public interest or not, right? But some of the most serious allegations that were made were not substantiated in any basic journalistic process that had integrity would have surfaced that. So, I mean, I think there absolutely should be defamation laws to protect people against that, right? I'm absolutely not I'm absolutely not an absolutist when it comes to free speech. And so I think it's a bit of a red herring in a way, because it's a complicated case, but anyone who's worked in newsrooms would know that that the most serious allegations didn't stand up. Or would have done enough checks to have ascertained that the most serious allegations, based on what we know now, didn't stand up. So I see. Absolutely, your point is well made that these issues cannot be more complicated. When you have bogeymen like Prigozhin, and it's very easy to make this clear cut. In real life, it's often more complex. But I think I would say that the laws of defamation are there also to protect good public interest journalism, because if you do good public interest journalism, you should be able to defend it. And if you do poor journalism, then you should be liable. Right? I don't know what other people think about that.
Well, I'm confused by the case you just made. I just don't know what the allegations are. The Hugh Edwards thing is just not something which is clear to me at all. So I don't talk about that. But of course, Rupert, you're correct. Their balance needs to be struck between freedom of expression and people's right to privacy and their right. I mean, some years ago there was the guy that was named as the suspect or the murderer of a woman down in the country. I can't remember, but completely wrong. You know, it shouldn't have been in the frame. It was a neighbour. Shouldn't. Was it? Jeffrey, yeah, shouldn't have been the frame at all. Quite wrong. You know, of course he's got a legitimate right to sue and vindicate his reputation. But that he's not Rosneft, he's not Abramovich, he's not any number of other people. So yeah, there needs to be a balance. But the law provides for the protection of those people, and as you know better than anyone, Rupert, I think, and privacy laws. If people are arrested, then they have got that reasonable expectation of privacy. So I think that, and we're not talking about that in anti-SLAPP discussion. So I think there are protections already there, and the balance needs to be moved to stop people like Rosneft causing a lot of problems when they shouldn't have been doing so.
Can I add one?
Yeah,
point
please.
to that?
Final comments from all of us, and then we're going to hand the mic to Charlie to tell us what the anti-SLAPP law is and isn't. So
The only thing I would say on that is that since privacy was introduced in 1998, it has been weaponized by claimants. So I totally agree with what you two have both said. I'm not advocating for free-for-all. There is room for defamation law, and there is definitely room for privacy law. But what has typically happened, because you couldn't get an injunction to restrain publication on the basis of libel, was people started to use privacy. And the definition of what was private and what was meant to be covered by privacy has been widened and widened and widened by case law over the years. So it is relatively recently, it's been accepted that if you've been arrested, that is technically private. And so I would caution, the privacy is used as a slapping mechanism, but we have to all be careful that you don't run stories that are going to create sympathy for a clampdown in the law. Bad cases make bad law.
Any other panelists before Susan wants to say something quick, and Charlie at the end, but any other comments from either of you, Nina and
I think in the case of what your question was, in case of individuals, there's a huge thing, especially with what I spoke out about sexual assault, is false allegations. And I think in this particular case, I did see a stat which was like something like men are more likely 230 times more likely to be raped than to be falsely accused of rape. So then you look at those kind of statistics when 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted in the UK. And yet there's so many of these cases of women being silent. So that I understand that's a huge issue, and it's a tragedy if the guy is falsely accused of rape. But at the minute, it is completely unbalanced. And when you look at the statistics of women and who suffer this gendered violence, something has to change. It isn't. it isn't right at the moment. So that's my opinion, just on my area that I know about.
Thank you. Do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, I think I can certainly see the point you're making. I think it's obviously true that if you did bring in a much more broad right to freedom of expression, it's not only going to be journalists like Open Democracy and Inside Housing and people like Nina who use that. There will be people like the people who broke the Hugh Edwards story who use it to attack people and run things that shouldn't be run. And of course, this whole debate is a balancing act between two different harms. I think that the problem really is that people don't understand the harms of the current position well enough. They don't understand the stories that they're not hearing and the targets that the media won't go after because, or the difficulty that somebody like Nina would have to, I think people walk around assuming that they have a freedom to expression. They just don't realize how quickly that could be taken away if they were to face some sort of legal action. And so I think that you would achieve a more honest debate that would be a little bit proof of the kind of swaying of the, public sympathy if more stories like the ones that have been shared tonight were kind of more widely understood. So in kind of pushing that debate forward is what I'd say is don't just kind of seize on the, oh, look, there's some Russian oligarchs, because that's the thing of the moment. It's like, look, this is something that affects ordinary people, that makes bad public policy because certain things aren't discussed, that limits the amount of news that is in your, social media news feed and on the BBC homepage. And once people come to understand that, maybe there would be an understanding that we need to shift that balance a little to the side of allowing people to express these things.
Thank you very much. So Susan, you wanted to say a couple of things and then we're going to get Charlie to do the anti-SLAPP model law 101.
Yeah, so I'm abusing my position as one of the organisers because I had a question, but I didn't realise I was running out of time to ask it. It was actually specifically for Nina. Firstly, congratulations on winning your case, and I really commend you for continuing that fight. I'm mostly work with journalists and kind of aware even the limited resources that journalists have access to. But as an individual fighting that case, you mentioned that you got some support from the Good Law Project and others. And I'm just curious how you went about getting that support, and if you had any advice for others who are in your position, and what you would say to them if they were sort of maybe in your position a few years ago when this started.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I get a lot of messages since I've won from women saying, I've suffered this and I want to speak out about it. How do I go about it? And that is a really big question to be asked. And as much as it felt like and the way it was presented by the press was a huge win, there's still so many things there's not enough protection to be able to speak out. So I do advise women to still be completely cautious. The way that I found the Good Law Project was when I was a litigant in person for the first year, I just emailed everyone basically. I was just trying to get help from it everywhere, and I personally knew someone who had worked with Tamsin Allen, and that's how I got in touch with her. So I was very lucky, and I know that not many people would get the kind of support that I got. But I guess everything that's been touched on in terms of the way that I wrote the social media post, I would do it if I had to do it all again. I'd do it very, very differently because, like you were saying, Caroline, it doesn't matter what you want to say if you know what the truth is. Even what you want to mean, there's no nuance. You don't decide what the court decides the meaning is. So I would do it very differently, and I think it's such a huge there's so many different legs to defamation law that it's really hard to advise women, apart from just be cautious and just put it out in black and white what happened, and don't elaborate on anything, and don't try not to put your opinion as much as you can, really. That's all I can offer at the minute.
Could I add a little bit to that, which is I think this is true for everyone, but if you're going to speak out, get legal advice before. It's
Yeah.
way less expensive to do it before than to do it after. And there are, I mean, I mentioned Reporters Shield, but there's also Thomson Reuters Foundation, which has something called Trust Law, which gives free legal advice. They don't advertise this, but many lawyers also do low bono, which is very effective sometimes, particularly if it's low bono advice before publication. So it's not a large amount of work for them, and they believe in the public interest. So many of the law firms that you see representing clients in cases like these that are sort of specialize in human rights law of one form or another are worth seeking out before you publish. And I don't know, Susan, if you have any other thoughts as well.
As I said, you know, me personally, I've mostly been working with journalists. However, as the UK Anti-SLAPP Coalition, we're a much wider group, and there are people like English Pen and Index on Censorship, who are the other co-chairs, who have a much wider remit. And so we are in contact with some lawyers, and there is a possibility, you know, no guarantees.
Can you say, should I name the website to go to?
Exactly, we do have a website. I know Talia was going to maybe mention a little bit more about that later. And there might be some flyers that you can find if you're here.
For people joining online, though, we'll make sure.
Online,
yeah.
Yeah. So there is help out there. You know, it's limited, but certainly the first step is trying to reach out to people and see what's possible.
Thank you. Okay, Charlie. We've talked a lot about the anti-SLAPP model law. We've talked around what it is and what it isn't. So give us anti-SLAPP model law 101 and where we are.
I'll try to be as concise as possible, and also to keep it focused on some of the questions that came up. But I should start by saying that it was really thanks to the support of people like Caroline and Rupert back there, who was so supportive and incredibly helpful that we got to this point. But I just say this, the model law was based on an analysis of the way that SLAPPs operate in the UK, as well as a comparative analysis of anti-SLAPP laws that exist around the world. But the way they, as has already been commented on, the way they operate in the UK tends to be through the litigation process. It's because of these astronomically high costs that make it so easy to weaponize that process. And so while some laws are more amenable to abuse than others, in the sense that they can be stretched out more effectively, and defamation law is a good example of that, there are a number of vehicles, SLAPP vehicles that we see, so laws that we see being used, data protection laws, for example, privacy law, but also laws. I mean, one of the things that I noticed was that, you know, George Monbiot wrote an article in 2003 about the weaponization of the Protection Against Harassment Act. It's an example about these laws which could be used in this way. So it was from these analyses that we really put together or built three different principles, and it's the model anti-SLAPP law is built around these three principles. So the first one is that given that SLAPPs operate through the litigation process and try to stretch that out as long as possible, we need to ensure that SLAPPs are disposed of as quickly as possible, and that's where we talk about an early dismissal mechanism. The second principle is that costs need to be kept as low as possible for the defendant. So we need to ensure that certain procedural safeguards are built in to ensure that those costs are minimized. And finally, that the costs for the SLAPP filer are as high as possible, so that there is a deterrent built into the system. And that's why we've been advocating for certain sanctions in the form of punitive damages. But I'll just say two things very quickly. I'm sorry to drag on, but I think it's just important because it goes to another couple of points, and that's to do with the early dismissal mechanism. So the first one is just to echo what Caroline said about the importance that this is an objective test, that we're not relying on a subjective inquiry into the mind of the filer. That's absolutely crucial. And it goes to another point which was raised about definition. I think legally speaking, definition should not be necessary for courts to spend hours trying to decide whether or not a case is a SLAPP, because all you really need or should have is for a higher threshold to be introduced for those who are filing lawsuits targeting acts of public participation, public interest speech. And so that's what we've been arguing for in the model law, a higher threshold, so that those targeting such lawsuits targeting such subject matter have to show that there is a likelihood of prevailing at trial. And the final thing I'd just say, very briefly, to go into that, sorry, realizing going on there too, is just to emphasize that need for the higher threshold. And that is really just to say that we do already have certain pre-trial mechanisms that have been shown, as we've seen time and time again, to be wholly inadequate. So it's really important that we have that extra layer of protection, and that's what the model law provides. Thank you. Sorry, I went on so long.
Not at all. Thank you so much. So we agree we're in the foothills. This is very important. What you just outlined is really important to get done. It's not going to fix everything. It's not the end of the job, but it's a really important milestone along the way. So thank you for laying that out. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to these wonderful panelists. I'll leave you with the final words, and then we're going to hand over to our hosts to tell us about the website and drinks.
Hi everyone, my name is Dalia Nasreddin and I'm the UK campaigns manager at Kingspan. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, both in person and online. It's been a great pleasure to hear speak everybody, and thank you, Mary, for chairing this conversation. The UK Anti-SLAPP Coalition has finally now a website which everybody can join to and sign up to be kept up to date. Our QR code is here on the sliplet, which is found both outside and I think downstairs. And please do join us for refreshments, which I think they're downstairs. I don't have the paper here, so I think they're downstairs. Thank you so much for joining.